Greetings. I'm remaking this video because the YouTube user The Black Hat pointed out that I was consistently mispronouncing Jonathan Haidt's name. He's right, I was. I hate getting things wrong, so thank you, The Black Hat, for the correction. I hope this re-recording goes well. There's a YouTube video of Jonathan Haidt giving a lecture entitled Two Incompatible Sacred Values in American Universities that I'd like to comment on. I haven't watched many Haidt videos yet, but it's clear that as an academic, Haidt concerns himself with facts, which is good. And I like this video of his, and I recommend watching it. I'll give the URL at the end of this video. I do have comments to make about it, the first of which is the subject of this video. The first comment actually is about a matter of fact. Rather late in the video, Haidt is discussing social justice, saying that it isn't clearly or consistently defined, which may very well be true. He says, and I agree, that when social justice focuses on unequal treatment of individuals based on category membership, race, gender, sexual preference, ethnicity, then social justice is simply a kind of justice, and no one should object to social justice so construed. That's not where he sees a problem with social justice. It's when social justice is based on disparity of outcomes instead of on inequality of treatment that he quite reasonably objects. When social justice focuses on achieving equal outcomes for all groups, he says, it becomes something different. It becomes, or threatens to become, what I'll call Harrison Bergeron social justice. I'll explain that in a minute. Haidt makes up an example in which, even though boys have far more behavioral problems in school than girls do, a so-called social justice warrior might call for boys and girls to be suspended at equal rates, forces schools to suspend girls for minor infractions, but to overlook much worse infractions by boys. Either that or not to suspend anybody. I am not here commenting on the possible reasonableness of recognizing a difference between growing up in a male body and growing up in a female body, and of therefore separating boys and girls into their own classes, and then tolerating more vigorous behavior in the boys' classes than would be tolerated in the girls' classes. I imagine there are arguments for and against such an arrangement, but I don't think the classes in the Minneapolis schools were divided by gender. Anyway, it's only a made-up example to illustrate his point. But what it illustrates is indeed Harrison Bergeron's social justice. Kurt Vonnegut wrote a short story entitled, you guessed it, Harrison Bergeron, in which smart people had to wear headsets or have implants or some such blaring noise at them to make it harder for them to focus, so that they wouldn't be better at intellectual tasks than other people, and in which fast runners had to wear ankle weights in order to slow them down, so they wouldn't be faster than other people, and so on. In which people who were good at doing things were given handicaps, so as not to be so good at them, on grounds that equality demanded it. This, of course, is absurd. It would be social justice run amok. If a math teacher teaches two students exactly the same way, but one, being naturally good at math, gets an A on the test, but the other, not being naturally as good at math, gets a C on it, the teacher hasn't done anything wrong. Equality of treatment is what is demanded. The most one might argue for is the schools hire tutors to help the weaker students, or that part of mathematics instruction consists of the better students helping out the weaker students in an effort to help reach the goal of all students achieving understanding of the material and gaining facility in solving math problems. But no one should mistreat those who are good at something simply in order to achieve equality of outcomes. Haidt is completely right in this. Anyway, Haidt made up the example about cracking down on girls and going easy on boys, starting just before the 59-minute mark of his video, to illustrate his point. Unfairly cracking down on girls while going easy on boys in order to reach equality in the suspension rate would indeed be wrong. But fortunately, it's only a made-up example. But then Haidt gets to a real-life example. In 2014, apparently, Blacks and Latinos were suspended 10 times more often than whites and Asians in Minneapolis public schools. Because so many people confuse 10 times more often than and 10 times as often as, I usually can't tell whether the person making such a claim means 10 times more often than, which is 11 times as often as, or whether he actually means 10 times as often as. However, the precise meaning is not the point here. The point is that there is a large difference in rates of suspension. The Civil Rights Act prohibits discrimination by race, and Haidt cites a letter sent by the Obama administration's Department of Education, Office for Civil Rights, to a Minneapolis school district. Haidt complains that the letter is an instance of mistaking disparity of outcome for inequality of treatment. But here's how the letter begins. I know this because Haidt displays the first paragraph, and also because I've found the letter online using Google. Dear colleague, 60 years ago, the Supreme Court famously declared in Brown v. Board of Education that education is a right which must be made available to all on equal terms. Today, I write to call your attention to disparities that persist in access to educational resources, and to help you address those disparities and comply with the legal obligation to provide students with equal access to those resources without regard to race, color, or national origin. This letter builds on the prior work shared by the U.S. Department of Education on this critical topic. Haidt underlines the part reading, address those disparities and comply with the legal obligation to provide students with equal access to those resources without regard to race, color, or national origin. And his description of the content of the letter is as a dear colleague letter saying, you'd better even the rates out or we're coming after you. He then puts on screen a Minneapolis Star-Tribune article entitled, Minneapolis Schools to Make Suspending Children of Color More Difficult. Its summary paragraph reads, Minneapolis public school officials are making dramatic changes to their discipline practices by requiring the superintendent's office to review all suspensions of students of color. Which, if you read the article, you realize isn't quite correct. It was only when proposed suspensions were for nonviolent offenses that they were to be reviewed by the superintendent. Haidt also shows two sentences from later on in the article proper, which read, the moratorium has helped reduce overall suspensions by 50%, Johnson said. She remains committed to completely eliminating the racial suspension gap by 2018. Johnson refers to Bernadette Johnson, who was superintendent at the time. Haidt has that last sentence with its statement of commitment to completely eliminating the racial suspension gap by 2018 underlined. Haidt then points out that we know that the violation rate for Black and Latino boys is in fact higher, as we know not only by knowing that their crime rate outside of school is higher, but also by knowing, in Haidt's words, that boys raised in households where boys raised without marriage, boys raised with men cycling through the home, have many more behavior problems. His overarching question is then whether the goal of equalizing rates of punishment, given unequal rates of behavioral infractions, is fair. Obviously, he thinks it isn't, and given the facts he cites, no, it's not fair, at least not without taking steps that equalize the rates of infractions. And that illustrates for Haidt how it is that when social justice demands equal outcomes without concern for any relevant differences, it is not just, but is instead unjust. And as Haidt says, the only way to achieve those equal outcomes is through injustice. I'll have more to say about the use of fundamentally unjust measures to try to correct or mitigate historical or existing social injustices, as with affirmative action. Although not in this video. But his point is generally correct. We shouldn't treat members of one class badly in order to achieve equal outcomes. What we should be concerned with is equal treatment. So, if I agree with Haidt, what's the problem? Well, I fear that a certain percentage of people viewing Haidt's video, upon seeing this particular example, drawn as it is from the Obama administration, will react by thinking, oh, those stupid liberals, mixing up unequal treatment and disparate outcomes, and then they put into place policies that reflect their stupidity. Grr, we have to vote out those liberal idiots. Or, worse, that they'll think, oh, those devious liberals, intentionally conflating disparate outcomes with unequal treatment. What won't they do to achieve their evil liberal society reshaping goals? But I looked up the October letter sent by the Obama administration's Department of Education, Office of Civil Rights, to that Minneapolis school district. And I looked up the earlier directive referred to in that October letter, which was sent by the Obama administration's Department of Justice, Civil Rights Division, and by the Obama administration's Department of Education, Office of Civil Rights, in January of the same year, almost 9 months earlier. And I looked up that Star Tribune article describing the alteration in policy undertaken by that Minneapolis school district. You know what? I didn't find a confusion of equal treatment with disparate outcomes. I didn't find a mistaking of disparate outcomes for unequal treatment. That's not what I found. Instead, I found a high degree of awareness of the difference between the two. By the way, I've been saying disparate outcomes. Haidt says disparate outcomes. Disparate is probably the slightly more common pronunciation, but I prefer disparate. Now, I'm not going to read the whole Minneapolis letter or the whole earlier directive, which is actually called a joint Dear Colleague letter, or the whole Star Tribune article. Much of what's said in the letter and the directive is an explanation of legal points about the law having to do with discrimination, and mostly, I don't want to bore you with it. If you're interested, you can look them up and read them yourself. I've already read them. I'll include the URLs at the end of the video. Of this video. But let me point out, first, the Minneapolis letter. Let's look at it. Here's the first paragraph. It's a little lengthy, but bear with me, it's not too long. Dear colleague, 60 years ago, the Supreme Court famously declared in Brown v. Board of Education that education is a right which must be made available to all on equal terms. Today, I write to call your attention to disparities that persist in access to educational resources, and to help you address those disparities and comply with the legal obligation to provide students with equal access to those resources without regard to race, color, or national origin. Please notice that. Disparities in access to educational resources. The legal obligation to provide all students with equal access to those resources. That's what the letter is about, not disparities of outcome, disparities of access. That is to say, disparities in educational opportunities. Back to the letter. This letter builds on the prior work shared by the U.S. Department of Education on this critical topic. There's a footnote here, and if you look it up, you find that the footnote reads, see generally, Dear Colleague letter from Secretary Riley on resource equity, dated January 19th, 2001, the day before George W. Bush took office. But then I put this next little bit in boldface in my transcript. Citing evidence that students in school districts with higher percentages of students of color have access to fewer and lower quality resources than students in districts with fewer students of color. which of course hurts all of the students in the school districts having higher percentages of students of color. And it goes on, and summarizing the obligation under Title VI to allocate resources in a non-discriminatory manner. And it tells you where you can find it. And then it cites another document from 2013. So we're getting close to 2014 when the letters in question were sent. Something from the US Department of Education called For Each and Every Child, a Strategy for Education Equity and Excellence. Hereinafter called the Equity Commission Report, it says. And it tells you where to find it. And then it says, and I put this in bold, the Equity and Excellence Commission was a congressionally mandated convening of 27 leading education experts, researchers, and policymakers representing a wide array of perspectives on education reform. The Equity Commission report, offered by the Equity and Excellence Commission to the Secretary of Education, details the problems of education inequality and offers unanimous policy recommendations at the local, state, and federal levels addressing these problems. Okay. Back to the letter. Across the country, teachers, administrators, and local and state officials are working tirelessly to improve our schools through exciting innovations. I don't know how exciting they are, but through exciting innovations in teacher recruitment, hiring, assignment, evaluation, support, development, and retention. They are also upgrading school facilities, expanding access to advanced courses, increasing the availability of technology in the classroom, and employing more well-prepared staff to support the work of excellent teachers. The department applauds these efforts and will make every effort to support them while ensuring that the provision and allocation of educational resources afford equal educational opportunity. Equal opportunity for all students. Here, there are footnotes saying what the joint letter is all about. The first of which says, this letter addresses legal obligations under Title VI of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, etc. And the other of which says, although, and then I underlined a little bit, although this letter focuses on the resource equity obligations of school districts, which seems to be about equal opportunity, equal treatment. States and individual schools that receive federal funds must likewise comply with Title VI's non-discrimination requirements, including non-discrimination in their provision and allocation of educational resources. Accordingly, OCR, Office of Civil Rights, strongly encourages state education officials and school administrators to closely review this letter and to take proactive steps to ensure that the educational resources they provide are distributed in a manner that does not discriminate against students on the basis of race, color, or national origin. In particular, state education officials should examine policies and practices for resource allocation among districts to ensure that differences among districts do not have the unjustified effect of discriminating on the basis of race. I'll get back to that word unjustified. It's important. Nowhere does this letter say that we should adopt a Harrison-Bergeron approach to unequal outcomes. It doesn't say that. It's not even addressed to outcomes. It's addressed to access. It's addressed to equal treatment. Now, it's a long letter. PDF is 37 pages long. And it has sections entitled The Problem of Unequal Access to Educational Resources and Legal Framework for Office for Civil Rights Enforcement Efforts, where both intentional discrimination and discrimination via disparate impact are explained. These are legal terms. Intentional discrimination might be having a policy that you enforce differently for members of two different racial groups. Or it might be intentionally adopting a policy that you know will adversely affect one racial group rather than another. But there's also discrimination via disparate impact. And that's where you might think, aha, Harrison Bergeron. No. Disparate impact, as used when discussing anti-discrimination law, is when you have a facially neutral policy, a policy which, on its face, doesn't seem to be discriminatory, but which, as applied, has an adverse effect on members of one group over another. But there is more that's necessary in order for such a policy to count as discriminatory. For one thing, it might be pretextual. Its adoption might just be a pretext for discriminating against one group over another. Then it would be discriminatory. But even if it's not pretextual, it might still be unjustified. I told you I'd get back to that word. If you adopt a policy for good educational reason, justifying the policy, and it happens to adversely affect members of one group more than another, but it's not pretextual, well, that might be okay. You do have to ask whether or not you really need the policy for some legitimate educational purpose, or whether there's an alternative way of achieving that purpose. And if you find that there's an alternative way of achieving that educational goal without having that policy, the one having the disparate impact, then you should drop it, because then it will count as unjustified, and it might well count as discriminatory. But if it's facially neutral, and if it's not pretextual, and if it's really needed in order to achieve an educational goal, it can't be replaced by a different policy that doesn't have the disparate impact, then it won't count as discriminatory. At any rate, the letter talks quite a bit about the law, about what would and would not count as a violation of Title VI. And it goes on to talk quite a bit about various resources: experienced teachers, well-maintained buildings, up-to-date course materials, extracurricular activities, available technology, and so on, to which students are supposed to have equal access. And it talks, too, about the enforcement of civil rights law by the Office of Civil Rights. And then its last part is its conclusion. Let me read it. We appreciate your attention to ensuring that students of all races and national origin backgrounds have equal access to effective teaching, adequate facilities, and quality instructional programs and support, and thus have an equal opportunity to attain the academic success upon which our future depends. Doesn't everybody agree that all school kids should have equal opportunity? We encourage you to share this information with other decision makers so you can examine together how to best promote the educational excellence of all students. I will point out that, in fact, promoting the goal of having all students succeed might, in fact, require unequal treatment, but not viciously unequal treatment. So, for instance, a school district might hire tutors to help the weaker students, or it might make part of its classes the helping of weaker students by stronger students, so that they can master the material and gain facility in solving problems. Those sorts of things would count as unequal treatment, but not as viciously unequal as nobody would be treated badly. Anyway, the letter doesn't make any suggestions about unequal but non-vicious treatment. This is just my own interjection. The letter finishes by giving various forms of contact information and then ends with a sentence: "We look forward to continuing our work together to ensure equal access to education," equal access again, "for all of America's students." Well, that letter certainly isn't proposing Harrison Bergeron solutions. I won't bore you by quoting much from the joint Dear Colleague letter from the United States Department of Justice, Civil Rights Division, and the United States Department of Education, Office for Civil Rights, issued on January 8th, 2014. Remember, the letter to the Minneapolis School District was dated October 1st, 2014, almost 9 months later. However, I do want to read an excerpt from the section entitled "Overview of Racial Disparities in the Administration of School Discipline." The Civil Rights Data Collection, CRDC, conducted by OCR, the Office of Civil Rights, has demonstrated that students of certain racial or ethnic groups tend to be disciplined more than their peers. For example, African American students without disabilities are more than 3 times as likely as their white peers without disabilities to be expelled or suspended. Although African American students represent 15% of students in the CRDC, they make up 35% of students suspended once, 44% of those suspended more than once, and 36% of students expelled. Further, over 50% of students who are involved in school-related arrests or referred to law enforcement are Hispanic or African American. Now, we'll remember here the point that disparate outcomes, which so far is what this paragraph talks about, do not necessarily imply unequal treatment. They might make you think, maybe we should look into why this is happening. But disparate outcomes do not automatically mean that there's unequal treatment going on. Haidt is certainly right about that. The letter continues. The departments recognize that disparities in student discipline rates in a school or district may be caused by a range of factors. So a range of possible factors, not necessarily discrimination. This joint letter recognizes that. But next comes a sentence I've put in bold-faced in my transcript. However, research suggests that the substantial racial disparities of the kind reflected in the CRDC data are not explained by more frequent or more serious misbehavior by students of color. Let me read that again. However, research suggests that the substantial racial disparities of the kind reflected in the CRDC data are not explained by more frequent or more serious misbehavior by students of color. That doesn't necessarily mean that there aren't differences independent of whether treatment is equal or not. It doesn't even mean that unequal treatment must be one of the contributing factors. Investigation would be required to determine that. It does mean that the disciplinary differences require more explanation than just, oh, but they act up more often, or, oh, but they behave worse. No. Back to the letter. Although statistical and quantitative data would not end an inquiry under Title IV or Title VI, significant and unexplained racial disparities in student discipline give rise to concerns that schools may be engaging in racial discrimination that violates the federal civil rights laws. For instance, statistical evidence may indicate that groups of students have been subjected to different treatment, or that a school policy or practice may have an adverse discriminatory impact, even though it might, we remember, be facially neutral. Indeed, the department's investigations, which consider quantitative data as part of a wide array of evidence, and I put this in boldface too, have revealed racial discrimination in the administration of student discipline. Oh. For example, in our investigations, we have found cases where African American students were disciplined more harshly and more frequently because of their race than similarly situated white students. In short, racial discrimination in school discipline is a real problem. And that's unequal treatment. I'm not going to read any more of it. The point is that no, President Obama's liberal Department of Justice and his liberal Department of Education did not stupidly miss the difference between unequal treatment and disparate outcomes, as one might suppose from Haidt's presentation. And no, they didn't deviously conflate the two as part of some evil liberal plot to undermine society. No, nobody should draw such a conclusion from Haidt's presentation, whether Haidt intended it that way or not. But What about that Minneapolis superintendent? What about those two sentences Haidt picked out and underlined? The moratorium has helped reduce overall suspensions by 50%, Johnson said. She remains committed to completely eliminating the racial suspension gap by 2018. Maybe she confused unequal treatment with disparate outcomes? Well, let's look at that Star Tribune article. First, the main point. Minneapolis public school officials are making dramatic changes to their discipline practices by requiring the superintendent's office to review all suspensions of students of color. The superintendent's office will review all suspensions of students of color, and somehow that's bad? One might, of course, suppose that it would be better to review all suspensions or all proposed suspensions, not merely those of students of color. What's the motivation for specifically reviewing proposed suspensions for students of color? Superintendent Bernadette Johnson, in dealing with new data showing Black students are 10 times more likely to be sent home than white students, decides to take those suspensions back to the individuals and try and probe and ask questions. Probe and ask questions. Well, that doesn't seem so bad. The article tells us that the new policy will be implemented as the district approves a settlement with the U.S. Department of Education, which was investigating the district over its inconsistent suspension treatment for Black students. The district treated Black students inconsistently? Maybe reviewing those proposed suspensions isn't such a bad idea. The article says that Superintendent Johnson said that far too often, school officials are suspending students of color for a behavior that doesn't lead to suspensions for white students. If that's true, and of course, looking in from the outside, I have no idea whether it's true or not. But if that's true, maybe it's good that, as the article says, beginning Monday, every proposed suspension of Black, Hispanic, or American Indian students that does not involve violent behavior will first be reviewed by Johnson or someone on her leadership team. Personally, I think I'd make those reviews universal. But one can understand the motivation for specifically looking at the ones that have tended to be violative of fair discipline. Now, the article also reports that the school district is also reducing its police presence at its schools after finding inconsistencies and questions about how schools used police in disciplinary matters. Again, it's difficult to evaluate such a statement from the outside. One can hardly expect perfect consistency from a collection of imperfect human beings, and I don't know what kinds of inconsistencies are being mentioned. Still, we'll take it at face value. The school district is reducing its police presence after finding inconsistencies and questions. Okay. According to the article, this is the district's latest attempt to reduce suspensions of minority students. Earlier this year, Johnson placed a moratorium on suspensions of pre-kindergartners and first graders. My reaction upon reading that was, really? Suspensions for such young kids? The article continues. The superintendent banned the suspensions after a Star Tribune report showed dramatic growth in the number of the youngest students being sent home. And that's when the article gets to these two sentences, the second of which Haidt underlined. The moratorium has helped reduce overall suspensions by 50%. She remains committed to completely eliminating the racial suspension gap by 2018. So apparently, there had been irregularities in the district's application of discipline. Several changes are mentioned in the article, all resulting from the district's settlement with the Department of Education. According to the article, the district also has agreed to increase staff, create a more robust data system, clearly define its suspension policy, and increase community and student engagement. Given that the changes are intended to eliminate existing discrimination in policies or practices, it's reasonable to measure the success of those changes by appeal to a reduction of the racial suspension gap. My only quibble would be that completely eliminating the racial suspension gap by 2018 might not be achievable simply by eliminating any discriminatory policies or practices. It might require that other actions be taken too, to address whatever other causes of that gap there might be. But Superintendent Johnson doesn't say that she intends to eliminate the suspension gap by any means necessary, including somehow hurting non-Black, non-Hispanic, non-Native American students. Although I'd prefer that her new policy would be to review all proposed suspensions for nonviolent offenses, rather than merely to review those of students of color. She doesn't indicate that she intends to institute a Harrison Bergeron solution. Haidt will have to judge for himself, but this doesn't look like social justice run amok to me. And I hope no one will conclude from this that liberals are stupidly confusing disparate outcomes with unequal treatment, or that liberals are deviously conflating the two for their evil liberal purposes. It's quite possible that the two are indeed sometimes conflated by liberals, by conservatives, by other people. But the example given here doesn't seem like such a case. And certainly, the evidence is that the Obama administration's Department of Education did indeed carefully distinguish between unequal treatment and disparate outcomes. I will make further comments about Haidt's video, which, again, I think is a good video, worth watching. But those other comments will have to wait for another video. And now, I would usually simply sign off by saying, as always, may reason and compassion be your guides. But in fact, I want to show those URLs, so I'm going to have to take a moment to pause the video, or more precisely, to pause recording. And now you can see the 4 URLs, one for the Haidt video entitled 2 Incompatible Sacred Values in American Universities, John Haidt Hayek Lecture Series. And then the URLs for the Minneapolis Letter, the earlier Department of Justice and Department of Education joint Dear Colleague letter, and the Star Tribune article. So there they are. And now I really will say, as always, may reason and compassion be your guides.